Okay, hello everyone. So my name's Tim Bennett. I'm the current serving chair for the Assessment Association. I'm going to do the closing keynote now, and we've got Isabel Nisbet. Isabel's a former CEO, one of the first CEOs of, I think the actual first CEO of Ofqual, which is the exam regulator for England. Isabel's also got a lot of experience on the international stage as well. She's done a lot of projects since then. So great breadth of knowledge and awareness. And Isabel's going to be talking about the fact that we're using technology, in assessment. It does raise a lot of ethical questions. We talk about digital divide, those kind of things. And obviously the worry is that the further we embrace technology, that there is the more of a risk that we're going to be ignoring part of the population, moving away, separating and creating a bigger digital divide. So, it's all these challenges that we kind of face. So, assessment needs to remain fair on that way. So, Isabel, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. Is assessment fair? Is my leaving question.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Can you hear me? Good. And it's a delight to be with you, and well done for getting here and for having such a good first day. I'm going to say a little bit before drinks about fairness, to give you something to think about and to argue about when you're having your celebrations later on. I'm going to start very briefly by looking at what we mean when we say is something fair or not fair, particularly when we're talking about assessment, looking at some of the challenges to fairness in assessment, and then a few fairness issues that are particular to e-assessment. And as you've heard, I'm going to say a little bit about the digital divide, which is a familiar issue to you, but a little bit about why that's about fairness and what it means. And I might do a little bit of myth busting while I'm going along the line. I'm going to say a little bit about opportunities for fairness in e-assessment, but those are just my ideas, and I know that you will have very many more, and more will come out of today and tomorrow's work. And lastly, I'll make some conclusions for those of you here, whether you're from the e-industry, whether you're from the wider assessment world, or education providers. And just to start off, the important thing, which may be obvious, but it's worth re-saying, is there's nothing new under the sun. The same underlying principles of fairness and unfairness apply to all types of assessment. It's not a unique little packet that applies to e-assessment. Of course, they may present differently with different modes of assessment. So, for example, you heard that I was the first CEO of Ofqual. Part of my life was being phoned up at 3 a.m. to be told that a white van had been hijacked and all the exam papers had been stolen. Well, that was familiar. More recently, I was on the board of a university in England, which was the victim of a successful cyber attack. And I was being phoned and told exactly what was being happened, particularly about the assessment material for students. Yes, it was a different presentation, but some of the issues, the underlying principles are the same, whether the assessments use books, pens, pencils, or computers. And the other thing that's the same is that we care deeply about unfairness. It's what the psychologists call a pre-social emotion. And any of you who are parents of young children do not need to be told that by me. It's not fair is a very, very common early complaint. In fact, I had a letter from a parent who said, "It's not fair" is the first sentence that my daughter ever learned. And the fact is that we mind a lot about it. And it's not just toddlers. There's some headlines that just I could have picked hundreds more. Students protest against the unfair maths question. It was supposed to be unfair because there was an arithmetical mistake in it. The students crying in the toilets and breaking down in class over the unfair exams. And then during COVID, when teacher assessment was much more brought in, suggestions that there was teacher, quotes, bias, and that made it unfair because that favored particular pupils. And then an American headline, which I just picked at random, 1 in 4 US school students lack adequate internet, and I'm going to come back to that, but that was also to be a source of unfairness. So it isn't just the toddlers. Everybody cares about this, and it's something that people think is very important. Now, what do we mean by fair? I'm not going to trundle through all of this to bore you to tears before your drinks, but it is important to know what you mean when you're accusing something of being unfair. Because in discussions about assessment and about education, almost all the debates about unfairness are completely at cross purposes, because the person who's complaining, Charlie Brown, is saying this assessment is unfair, means one thing, and the assessment provider who's answering it means something else by it. And so they just don't speak to each other at all. And I've distinguished then a few things that we do mean. One of them is quite straightforward. It's a formal sense that something's fair if it follows the pattern or the rules accurately, like a fair copier following the rules fairly. The second one, perhaps more important, and perhaps to do with the students crying in the toilets, is implied contractual sense that something's fair if it meets the legitimate expectations of those affected, but it's unfair if it doesn't. Nobody told me there would be a question about so-and-so, so-and-so. So that's the implied contractual sense. Now, the third one is the one that I think you're expecting me to talk about, which I've called relational fairness. It's treating like cases alike. That doesn't mean that everything is treated identically. I don't think, for those of you who're talking about your products here, I think it's unlikely that for many of them the outcome would be identical for every candidate who took your assessments. But you'd expect them to be judged by appropriate and similar principles. And so it's treating them alike in relevant respects. But of course, what's relevant is the devil in the question. But there's a fourth one, which is I've called retributive, which is something is fair if it's an appropriate reward or a penalty for what's gone before. My son deserved his A in maths because he's good at maths, he worked hard at it, and he did well in the paper. So that seems to be he's deserved it from what he's done. There's also, and I'm not going to say much about those, there's a consequential sense, which is that an assessment can be accused of being unfair if it leads to something that's unfair in the future. So in Ireland, there was a court case about whether it was okay to put in a student's certificate that they'd had exemption from certain parts of an assessment because of their disability. And it was thought that was unfair because it might lead an employer in the future to discriminate against this student. And that's a consequential sense. And perhaps more familiar is what, particularly in America, is a retrospective sense that something can be unfair because it's the result of injustice in the past. So, for example, different outcomes in your assessment for black students and white students in America could be traced back to the difference in the kind of support and teaching they had in an old historic segregated system of primary education, for example. And there's also, and this is another one to remember, differential esteem. And this is something's unfair if it legitimately causes offence, for example, in the language used or the pictures used or the examples used to some part of the candidature. I'm aware that in woke world, that's quite a big challenge, but it is there and people are aware of it. But probably the most important one, that what we talk about most of the time, is relational fairness, treating relevantly like cases alike. But I'm going to suggest to you that the retributive sense is very important, because fairness has two essential elements, all the discussions about it. One is a sort of equality, not identical equality, but some sort of relevant equality. And the other is about individual desert. And in providing and designing and manufacturing assessments, ignore one of these two at your peril, because I'm suggesting to you that that was one of the many reasons that people were so upset about using statistical models to allocate grades to individual students. They didn't think that the individual had deserved the grade that they got, even though relational fairness was in fact served by these statistical models. So both of them, equality and desert, are important. Now, fairness of what? Well, assessments. But there's lots of aspects of the test or the assessment you're working with itself. The type that's used, and this is familiar ground to everybody here, whether you're using extended answers and multiple choice, the choice between exams and portfolios, one-off assessment versus regular assessment and continuous assessment, and issues about design and development of tasks and questions, the design of the mark scheme, how the assessment is actually administered, the marking, scoring, all of these things. There are both technical aspects of them within your technical world, but also within the assessment technical world, and there's good practice there. There's also, however, fairness to be considered in the uses made of the test or assessment outcomes. So, for example, for selection for employment, or for entry to university or college, or for professional accreditation. And I know that there's been some discussion about assessment in a medical context with OSCEs and others earlier this afternoon. Now, I worked in medical education, and issues of fairness in fitness to practice licenses was crucial and was very much at the top of everybody's mind because their entire careers depended on that assessment. So it's very, very important then. And fairness to whom? Well, I think we're all assuming we're talking about people who take the test or the candidates. Yes, they're very important, but there are other people too. What about the ones who didn't take the test? It could be that there's some sort of selection process before your assessment is taken, or it could be, what about people who use the outcome of the assessment? And what about clients of your professional who's accredited to have fitness to practice? Supposing it's a brain surgeon that's going to operate on you next week. You'd be quite interested in the fairness of that assessment. I'm also suggesting to you that there are two ways of looking at your assessments. One of them I'm calling a situated way, and one is an isolated way. Now, the situated one sees your assessment, your product, as an event in time. It's taking place, in a real life context, with real things going on. Just to take a random example, a rail strike on the day of the exam. Now, the isolated view takes your test into the laboratory, really, and looks at its technical structure. It could look at the coding, for example, or the technical assessment design, issues of testing, pre-testing for validity and reliability. All these are really important things to do. But my view is that in considering fairness, we need to take both perspectives, and you must not exclude the situated view. It's not enough for the manufacturer of something, for example, of a piece of equipment that's sold, to say, well, it's not my concern if children use this improperly. They're required to think about that in advance and make provision for it. And similarly, I think we have to think of the assessment of the fairness of our assessments in a situated context. And that means thinking about the circumstances in which your assessments are being used, the equipment that's being used, the adequacy of the preparation of people who are taking it, the venues that the assessment is being taken in, who else is present, what else is going on at the time. All these things are relevant to fairness, and they're certainly relevant to fairness as perceived by those affected. Now, what are the challenges to fair assessment? I think that there are many, and again, they're not unique to e-assessment. Challenges to relational fairness. The most obvious one is the lack of comparability between the outcomes for different test takers or candidates. And the classic view by the assessment geeks is that an unfair assessment is one where there are different outcomes for construct irrelevant factors. So, for example, if the outcomes for girls were different from boys, even if these girls and boys were judged to have a similar ability in the construct being measured, if it was still different from them, there's something funny about the assessment. That's the idea. Now, looking at relational fairness with a situated view of your assessments, one challenge to fairness would be inequality among test takers in their access to the assessment and to the test-taking environment. It might be more accessible, it might be more possible for somebody to cope with than others, and that might not be relevant to the ability or the skill that you're assessing. Also, and again, a lot's been thought about this in America, there could be differences in the opportunities that your test takers have had to learn the material that you're assessing. It could be because of something in the past, it could be because of their context, it could be because of their background. And there is a debate going on about the relationship between differences of opportunity to learn and the fairness of the assessment itself. And that's a question which we haven't really got to the bottom of yet. But you need to think about that. How much is that your business and how much is that somebody else's business? And that's a live issue. Also, there's issues of lack of authenticity. And that's not unique to e-assessment, but many of you are familiar with it. For example, the wrong test taker. When I was involved with medical examinations for students who wanted to come to practice medicine in England, there was an example of one where the candidate's brother sat the test instead of him, for example. And because the people running the test didn't know who these students were, nobody noticed that for quite a long time. So lack of authenticity is a familiar topic with you. Issues around cheating, nothing new with that. My taxi driver last week told me that he used to write the answers to his questions in the stripes of his tie when he went in for his exam. But there are clearly issues of plagiarism and other forms of cheating that you're dealing with at this conference. And technical problems for some test takers. Papers lost, equipment doesn't work, power cuts, all of those are familiar things, but they can all be challenges to relational fairness because the one that has the power cut has a more difficult time than the one who doesn't have the power cut. And the thing you're assessing is not power cuts, but mathematics. That's the reason it's relevant to relational fairness. Now, retributive fairness, a challenge to that would be if the factors determining the outcome for each individual were not being able to be shown to be related to the work that that individual had done. If it seemed to be something else that was being applied, then that would be a challenge to fairness. The candidate might feel, that's not the mark I deserved. It's the mark that something's invented, but it's not about me. Also, I suggest that there can be challenges to retributive fairness if the tasks don't give the candidates the opportunity to show what they can do. If they give some people the opportunity to show what they can do, but not others, in the area that's relevant to the assessment, that's unfair on the ones that feel that they brought their harp to the party and nobody asked them to play it. It's that kind of feeling of unfairness. And also, if the mark scheme doesn't accommodate the approach taken by the learner. An example of a debate about that, which may be familiar to some of you, is about highly scaffolded mark schemes in mathematics. And you get some candidates on the autistic spectrum who simply do not follow that path at all. They follow a path like that, and they get to the same answer. They get to the right answer, but not by the, quote, right path. And is that fair to them in a retributive sense? Do they deserve the outcome they get with this scaffolding mark scheme? Now, I suggest that there's another challenge to relational fairness when you see assessments in the situated context, and it's the old chestnut of the digital divide. And I want to say a little bit about that in the context of fairness. And what we're talking about is a definition I've quoted here, a division between people who have access to and use of digital media and those who don't. And there's a good paper by Cambridge Assessment that looks at this in the context of arrangements during COVID, but I'm going to suggest to you that what they say is actually relevant beyond COVID. Where are we beyond COVID? It's still relevant to the wider world that we're in. And they talk, first of all, about differences of what they call digital access. Issues about physical access, actually having devices and access to the internet. What they call material access, and this is to do with the kind of device they have and the internet speed. Conditional access, and this is shared devices that they only have in the evening or they have to share with another student or something like that. And data poverty. And I'm going to pause on data poverty because in the world we're in now of standard of living crisis and many families having to balance priorities, the issues of poverty are becoming more acute for all of us than I think they have been at any time in my more recent parts of my own career, because people are choosing between spending money on food or spending money on transport, for example, and things like this. Now, what they mean by digital data poverty is the ability to afford the right kind of bandwidth and access to data that gives the richest educational experience. And I suggest to you that that may be lower in priority than food, for example, for many families, and that this might become an even more important issue in the future than it is now. And what they called motivational access, about attitudes towards using technology. Also, there's a question of the digital skills of those involved, the outcomes in terms of the student performance, and contextual factors. And again, I'm taking a situated view here. teachers and schools, the school infrastructure, the school's digital resources, and the teachers' digital access themselves and their digital skills. And you'll be familiar with research about England, which showed enormous differences between schools in the quality and the ability of teachers and schools to give the kind of rich online material for their students that they wanted to do. There's also the issue of the position of parents, their own skills and their engagement, and the whole question of the home learning environment. Being in a flat with working parents who are working from home and other children who are being homeschooled is a very challenging environment and affects the experience that's being taken. And I hope you can read that, but that's an example from an American report, which was very recent, 2021. It's the proportion of students without what they called appropriate or adequate connectivity. And this particular analysis distinguished between urban and suburban and rural, and by far the greatest challenges were in the rural communities in parts of America, but also they did it by race and ethnicity. And basically, their conclusion was that even in states with the smallest divides, 1 in 4 students lacked adequate internet access. And that, I suggest, is relevant not just to provisional arrangements with them during COVID, but the whole question of the future interaction with them in learning and assessment. Now, why am I talking about the digital divide? I suggest that it's clearly related to relational unfairness because it can lead to construct, irrelevant differences in outcome. The data-poor family with parents and working parents working from home and children homeschooled in one flat can have construct irrelevant differences in their outcome from those who've had high-quality training in their school and have got privacy and good access to home study and home assessment. The digital divide is particularly relevant when learning and assessment are done at home, but I suggest to you it's not just about that, because it can also contribute to unfairness if e-assessments are taken at school or college or a workplace. They can affect the opportunities to learn, and they can affect the familiarity and the accessibility of the mode of assessment being used. A digitally poor candidate can have a lot more challenges in coping with this than a digitally rich candidate. And I said I was going to bust a few myths. The one I want to try and puncture this evening is the digital native myth, which I think many of us were taught, which is that people like me are digital foreigners, but the new generation are digital natives and they're skilled by magic, they're skilled to participate in all the tasks you set. Now, I've suggested up on this slide here some sources which you can look at of international research, which suggests that that's a bit of a myth. Yes, exposure to technology is very different in the generation that followed me, but exposure doesn't equate with ability to use it, just as exposure to language doesn't equate to literacy or ability to understand or appreciate literature. It's a skills issue, and my conclusion from reading that, which to me was a bit of a learning experience, was that you cannot take digital skills for granted. They need to be learnt like other skills do, whatever generation we're talking about. Now, all of this has been rather negative about challenges and unfairness. I could say a little bit more positively about opportunities for e-assessment to be fairer. And I should say that I see fairness as a spectrum. It's not a binary. It's either completely fair or completely unfair. There's going to be always opportunities to make your assessments fairer. And I suggest that digital modes of assessment have particular potential for bringing about retributive fairness by making sure that the outcome of your assessment is matched to the input of the individual candidate. There are ways in which e-assessment can provide for that, for example, through adaptive testing, and I know you're looking at quite sophisticated examples of that at this conference. That gives the opportunity for each candidate a chance to show what they can do, even at the cost of some comparability. If my test results are not, my test product is not exactly the same as yours, it could still give much more rich information about me and rich information about you. And I hope that one of the ways that we're going to adjust our thinking in the future will be not to be so hung up about comparability that we lose sight of the value of matching the individual with what we can do. Also, digital means offer us an opportunity to assess practical skills in more realistic ways. And the fact that they're realistic is not just a technical point, it's to do with their fairness, because that makes them a much more realistic, a much more appropriate measure of the skills and knowledge of the person being tested. There's famous examples from the US Army of when you told the students to write about how to put gunpowder into a gun, then the white students did much better than the black students. When you actually asked them to put the gunpowder in the gun, they were more or less equal. And it was just that the essay writing skill was construct irrelevant, and it was relational unfairness. So even simulated practical tasks, which many of you are familiar with, are better than writing a story about it, which is a different kind of skill altogether. And for relational fairness, there's lots of opportunities to try and make sure that candidates with particular circumstances are all brought to more or less an equal starting point, particularly those with disabilities and special needs. And you'll be very familiar with the opportunities for those, but I've been hugely impressed by some of the things that I've seen in the ways, for example, that students with hearing or visual disabilities were assisted in showing what they could do in a very fair way. Now, that was my outline, so it's almost drinks now. But I did say that I would offer some conclusions, and that's just my conclusions, and you must be thinking whether you agree with me. My first conclusion is we must remember both relational fairness and retributive fairness, equality and desert. Don't forget either of them. I suggest that you should be doing risk analyses for fairness for the products that you're involved in and the assessments that you're using, and looking at both types of unfairness. Now, some mitigations or solutions could be, for example, in the technical design of the assessment itself. So, for example, you're familiar with tests for authenticity of various kinds. And also, there's a lot of good technical knowledge in the assessment world about the accessibility of the language of tasks and questions, issues about clear pictures and print and all the rest of it. And there's also a lot of expertise in having fair mark schemes. But as well as that, I suggest that those of us in the assessment world do need to take the situated view and consider the fairness of the contexts in which our assessments are taken and used. I'm suggesting to you that the digital divide and the issues around digital poverty in this day and age are issues beyond COVID. They're issues that are relevant to all of us and to the world that we're going to work, and we cannot take it for granted. That we need to invest in making the products that we offer fair, but also affordable, and we need to think hard about digital skills as part of the responsibility of what we do. And finally, like Charlie Brown, I think we all feel that fair assessment really matters, and unfair assessment matters big time. Fairness is not just a technical concept, it's a social concept in the world in which our assessments are situated. E-assessment has challenges, but it's also got opportunities for making assessment fairer. And it's the interests of everybody in this room to work together, to look at our assessments and to invest in making e-assessment fairer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. We've got time for just a couple of quick questions. I've got a couple of roaming mics. One particular point that you mentioned there about fairness risk assessment. Just a quick show of hands, people who regularly undertake a fairness risk assessment in their assessment programs.
Quality impact assessment.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so,
yes. That's, the equality impact is very good on relational fairness. It's not so good on the retributive fairness, the desert point. That, I know it's quite difficult to get your hands on that, but it isn't just about equality. I think that's one of the mistakes that the educational world has made. But it's good to do it, though.
So any questions for Isabel? I've got a quick question, which is about, is there a particular country in the world where you see them having probably one of the best attitudes towards fairness in assessment?
No, I think is the answer. If you ask me which countries are most obsessed with problems of fairness, I'd probably quote the United States. If I was at a conference of this kind there, or any conference about educational assessment, half the discussion would be about issues of social injustice and the relation between that and what people do in their technical work. It's become such a focus. That doesn't mean it's the best practice. There's some views about fairness that I think are highly controversial. So, for example, whether it's unfair for somebody to fail their diploma, their high school diploma, for example. There is a view among some that it's unfair to fail because everybody's got an entitlement to pass. So that becomes highly controversial. So I think, I do not think we should feel guilty. I think we should feel that this is something that everybody's exploring. Yeah. But I do think that one of the things in this country and in countries that have high stakes end of school examinations, concern about those becomes very public. It's something that people discuss at the bus stop, and they discuss more than in some other countries which don't have such an end-loaded, high-stakes end-of-school exam system.
Yeah. Any other questions? I've got one question here for Sarah.
Thank you. Sarah Corcoran from ACCA. First of all, Isabel, thank you for a really thought-provoking session. It was really interesting, I'm sure has got a lot of us thinking some very deep thoughts. To be honest, I was feeling quite deflated. I'm glad you ended on the opportunities rather than the challenges, because there are clearly lots of challenges there which are for all of us to consider. I think trying to lift myself up a little bit, maybe, I was thinking there are things we can do, but a lot of the challenges you've highlighted are really big challenges that are almost beyond what we can do as assessment bodies. They're government challenges, and I wondered if you could say a little bit about where you see the focus really should be for addressing some of these very big fairness issues.
Yes, thank you for that. I spoke to a lady at a conference after a session I'd been involved in, and she said that when she started working in an exam board, she, to begin with, was so depressed because of all the things she was reading about. And then she decided, well, my job is just to design the mark scheme. And so she was quite happy for a number of years. And then she listened to my talk and she was unhappy again. I think what I would say is, first of all, two things. First of all, that I don't see fairness, as I say, as a binary thing. And it's always going to be unfair, so we're in a hopeless world. I see it as, if you could imagine the concept of health, even though we can never get over the fact that there's so many other factors in health, like genetic inheritance and climate and income and the economy and government and all the rest of it. But there are small ways in which we can improve our own health, and if you're teachers or whatever, you can improve the health of those we work with. So there are ways in which things can be made fairer in the same way as it can be made healthier. The other thing is that if you think of the manufacturers of products that are sold in polythene bags, you can think of them saying, well, we can't be responsible for irresponsible parents who allow their toddlers to open these polythene bags and suffocate to death. But there are things that we can say in conversations. So, for example, if I'm in an exam board, could be involved in my organisation discussing the context and say, are there statements which we can responsibly make about guidance in the ways that it is good to use this assessment and guidance in ways that it isn't good to use it. And that will nudge it along the fairness route. And I think there are good examples of that, of statements being made, not to become the government or to become a social worker, but to say that, for example, be aware that students who might be disadvantaged by this type of assessment that we're offering you could be those. So ways of looking out for it are so-and-so. It's sensible guidance. It's using your peripheral vision a little bit and being prepared to make statements using it. And don't get too depressed, I think.
I think that's a perfect note to leave it on. Don't get too depressed. Although there will be plenty of drinks served tonight, so just go easy. Thank you very much, Isabel. That's been excellent.
Thank you.
Very much. So it's just for me, really, just to close. I do need these notes because I've been, if you noticed, I've been tucked away next door. What did I miss in here? Did anything happen? I could hear mumblings coming through. I assume it was an excellent session through there, and I've heard from the feedback in here that it's been excellent sessions in here as well. So the first thing I want to say is thank you to everyone who you've all made the endurance test of getting here despite the rail strike. You know, we've kept it on track. You're able to let off some steam tonight. You know, all those kind of things. I'll throw in a few more puns there as well. But you know, you've done brilliantly, and it's been fantastic that we've had so many people turn up. It's been excellent. This session, this event would not be able to take place without I'm going to say a few thank yous. Obviously towards the EAA, the operations team of the EAA and the board members have done some fantastic activities. And we've still got a brilliant day to come tomorrow. We've got the awards gala dinner tonight. But I just want to say a quick thanks to PSI, the sponsors, for the conference, and also for British Council for sponsoring the awards dinner tonight and the awards series. When I look out in the exhibition area as well, I think it's some amazing exhibits and some amazing technology and some brilliant things going on out there. Technology is hard. Technology in assessment is difficult. Technology in delivering presentations next door is very hard, especially when we've got lots of different people turning up. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. You're going to, as a basketball phrase, whatever way, you miss 100% of the shots you never took. So we never know what's around the corner. So we need to be trying these things. We need to be doing them. We need to be testing them. We need to keep this momentum going. So thank you to everyone who's helping us do that. So tonight we've got the awards dinner. We need to clear out of here pretty sharpish. This is going to be where the event's going to take place. So this room will be cleared out completely. So make sure you take everything with you. The bar, I believe, is open. I think, Matt, is it your card's behind the bar? Is that correct? There you go. So just follow Matt. Yeah. Where's my card, actually? Where's my wallet, Matt? You've got it. So just thank you to everyone today. Thank you for all the brilliant presentations and really thank you for making it through the traffic and things. So enjoy yourselves tonight. Again, let off some steam. I'll put that joke out there again. Come on. And we'll see you all tomorrow for another fantastic conference. So thank you very much.